The key takeaway from this video is that the Supreme Court is most willing to allow the government to restrict or infringe upon your rights and freedoms during times of crisis if the main reason that the government is stating that they're doing that is to protect people or protect the country as a whole. So it's like this delicate balance between your freedoms, your liberties, and then the government providing security. So, for example, in 1966, the Supreme Court ruled that law enforcement just can't assume that you know what your rights are. So, as part of the Miranda v. Arizona case, the Miranda rights were born, where basically when you are arrested or detained by law enforcement, you're basically read your rights. You have the right to remain silent, right? You have the right to an attorney. Like we've all heard these before in some sort of like movie or TV show or something like that, right? Technically, if law enforcement didn't read an individual their rights and didn't tell them that they had a right to remain silent, didn't tell them they had a right to an attorney, and the individual confessed to a crime without receiving this warning, like the confession could be excluded from trial. So these rights are important. But the court has ruled that there is such thing as a public safety exception, right? Which basically means law enforcement maybe can bypass reading Miranda rights if there's an immediate danger and that has to be like neutralized, right? So again, the expectation is that law enforcement is going to read a suspect their Miranda rights, but this could be bypassed if there was immediate threats or a security violation or just something really bad that was going on that law enforcement had to neutralize like very quickly, right? So that's an example of this delicate balance between security and like your freedoms. Also, like historically, like if you look at the Civil War in 1861, right? President Lincoln actually suspended habeas corpus in the border states. We talked about what habeas corpus was, like the need to inform a judge about the preliminary charges against an individual so they could decide if they're going to be held over for trial or not. The states in the red were states that had slaves but remained loyal to the North during the Civil War. They made a large percentage of the food, and President Lincoln knew how critical they were. So by suspending habeas corpus in the border states, this basically allowed Lincoln to arrest anybody that was advocating that these states leave and fight with the South against the North. Without habeas corpus, he could arrest anybody just for political opposition and didn't necessarily have to justify his actions to a judge that clearly would argue that this is not something you could arrest an individual for. So it's just an example of like desperate times call for desperate measures. One of your rights most vulnerable during times of crisis when the government's like trying to do anything they can do to provide law and order and security, right? Look at Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, right, where the nation of Japan engages in a sneak attack against this American naval base in the Pacific, right? This is what ultimately would pull the United States into World War II. Well, what followed? President Roosevelt basically issued an executive order that forced Japanese Americans on the West Coast to report to like internment or like detention camps for the duration of the war. People were making the argument that it was not possible to tell a loyal Japanese American from a potential Japanese spy, and that this was something that was necessary to protect the country, right? Could look back all these years later and sort of be like horrified by this decision, which is equivalent to really like racial profiling. The Supreme Court, however, disagreed with those that criticized this decision. In the famous case of Korematsu v. United States, they basically upheld FDR's executive order that created these internment camps, basically, again, under the premise that desperate times call for desperate measures. That would the United States government have been able to do this at a time of peace? No, but that this was what the United States government needed to do to provide security to the country. September 11th is another great example. This is the terrorist attacks that took place on September 11th, 2001. The Patriot Act is a law that's passed shortly after September 11th that basically is meant to cut down on future acts of terrorism. And among other provisions, it was basically allowing the government, if they were trying to combat terrorism, to do things that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do during times of peace, such as listen to your phone conversations without a warrant, remotely accessing your computer without a warrant, basically getting your internet search records, your library records, your medical records without a search warrant, denying habeas corpus rights, right, for non-citizens. None of these things probably could be done in a time of peace, but the courts were willing to allow the government to do this kind of stuff to protect the country from future acts of terrorism. And in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, people weren't complaining about their civil liberties being sacrificed. People were so shell shocked by the actual event that they kind of were willing to turn them over. As we got further away from the actual event itself, people became more uneasy with how many freedoms people were giving up in the name of protecting the country against terrorism. And then think about like the COVID pandemic, right? Same kind of thing, right? In that there were lots of issues that the government was trying to implement policies and procedures, and people were questioning whether or not their rights were being infringed in the process of that, right? Could the government force vaccine and mask mandates? Could the government force businesses to close? Could the government tell your religious place of worship that they weren't allowed to have in-person services because of occupancy limits and person-to-person contact and those types of things? So again, generally, we tend to see the greatest conflict between government and then the rights that Americans have during times of crisis, when the government's able, typically because of the courts allowing them to get away with more in order to provide security and safety for the nation as a whole.